This hour sponsored by Addo, the power behind the storage.
This is NAB Show Live.
Hello and welcome to NAB Show Live, powered by Broadcast Beat. So for this session, we're going to be talking all about sports. So I've got three guests with me. So I've got Jay from Supernor, Andy from BT Sport, and Ken from Sports Video. So I think the first question really is, what are you seeing that's new for sports in 2019, and especially for the big year of 2020? Who's first?
Well, you know, we've been obviously at SVG, we go track out all the events and do a lot of traveling around, seeing what people are doing from a production standpoint. I think that for me, the biggest thing I've seen this year, which was interesting, was CBS of the Super Bowl used 8K, deployed 8K within a super zoom, I guess, is that the right word?
Yeah.
Super zoom extraction mode. They didn't get to use it in the game because the game was so terrible. But what was interesting was the week before, in the championship game, there was a play where they actually could have used that. They had a 4K camera, but when they zoomed in, I think their resolution was around 700 lines, so it was definitely not HD.
Yeah.
So I think they proved the case for why you need 8K, so I'm curious to see how 8K will have a role within sports productions. But I mean, look, the shows are getting bigger, as you know. They're getting more robust. The OTT stuff, platforms are getting more content and original content.
Yeah.
So those are some of the big trends, but more is better with sports.
Yeah. Jay, what are you seeing?
Well, I think one of the things we want to talk about also is, where we're seeing a lot of move towards, remote production and more centralization of management of the overall infrastructure. And I think, the FIBA World Cup that's going to be in China this summer is an interesting example of that, where you're having a lot more vertical integration because you have a sort of top-down control, by the federation itself, and also with a very, sort of difficult environment from an infrastructure standpoint. I mean, China's a very modern country, but it has its own challenges in terms of getting signals here and there with some clarity and certainty. So I think that's one of the things that'll be very interesting to see how that goes.
Yeah. Andy?
I think it's, some of the stuff's been mentioned. We're going to see things like HDR really become mature.
Yeah.
HDR Live, there's been lots of HDR posts for a long time and it's great, but HDR Live is much more complicated as we've seen. But I think we'll start to see it reach maturity this year and into next year with the Olympics and things.
Yeah.
We've already announced that at some point in the next year we will launch an HDR proposition, so we're working hard on that.
Right.
I think cloud has been bubbling away for a while, and I think we'll get to the point probably in the next 18 months where some form of proper cloud-based production is now possible. And there are proof of concept products from a number of vendors here sort of showing it. They're still a little bit early, missing some of the features that are needed, but I think we'll start to see that ramp up as they increase the tool sets to become really valuable rather than just a bit of an interesting idea.
Yeah.
So when you've been wandering on the show floor, I know that HDR has been very complicated and complex the last couple of years. Are you feeling that are the live solutions becoming more holistic and easier on the floor, or is it still a little complicated as far as the formats, the flavors?
It's still complicated. I think the ecosystem we've designed as an industry is not great. We've come up with a variety of different formats, and truthfully it's going to be difficult to interop actually, because different people in different sports organizations, different territories are going to do different things, which is going to be a headache for the likes of OBS and the Olympics and so on and so forth. And truthfully, generating really good HDR with really good SDR with a single production workflow is really hard, but we have to do that to make it commercially viable, and we will do it. And we've been working really, really hard. Did a big broadcast the other day, FA Cup quarter-final game at Watford, where we did exactly that, HDR-centric production with all the things we have to have, 22 cameras, VAR integration, Piero analysis, HDR replays, graphic, the works. So it's doable, but it is still technically very complicated and needs a lot of expertise to make sure it doesn't go wrong. And that's the problem. The danger is that you can make it, if you're not careful, things can go wrong.
Right.
But I think that will come easier. There's more product coming. I think we'll start to share some knowledge. That'll help as well. But I think the interop's probably the challenge with different people having different philosophies, because I see now different people doing very different things in different territories, which makes it very hard to content share.
Yeah.
Yeah, and Jay, you spoke about remote production. I mean, what are you seeing as the benefits of that?
Well, I think it's most people are looking at it from a sort of economic standpoint, but I think the real drivers here are about quality control and consistency.
Yeah.
The overall complexity of on-site productions. As I came into this industry 3 years ago, I'm continually shocked at the amount of inefficiencies and what I'll call wastage in a very expensive environment, and the concerns over the risks of anything going wrong, which of course is a major impediment to migrating in the cloud and things like that. But ultimately, you can start to have a better controlled environment. You can have operators that are more experienced because they can do 3 or 4 games in a week instead of 1 or 2. You might end up with people with lower divorce rates because they're not traveling all the time. There might be an period, by the way, with higher divorce rates. Where people come home and find out a few things they didn't mean to.
Wait, there are a lot of people who I have heard divorce rates will go up if they have to be home. I have honestly heard that from people.
To jump in, I think for us, we've done a lot of work on remote, and there's a lot of people who are more advanced than us, but we think there's like 3 tiers of remote, depending on the type of content we're making and the type of sport or the league, and so we've kind of developed 3 tiers. One is kind of entry level, based around cellular bonded technology, 4 or 5 camera events. But you kind of cap out in the 4G world at about 4 or 5 cameras and run out of bandwidth. But it's great for smaller events where you haven't got to have loads of cameras. Then we have this middle tier football kind of model, which we're using 4K satellite technology for actually. So we put up a pair of satellite paths in 4K. We use the quadrants to bring back 4 separate 1080p 50 signals. We put camera 1 on both in case we lose one. And then we also complement that with from a mobile viewpoint or some cellular bonded things on cameras that don't need to be synchronous. So for example, net cams in the goals don't need to be synchronous, they're a replay only. So we can get about 9 or 10 cameras. And that's actually a really comprehensive production. And then we can move on to the full kind of fiber integrated high end, which starts to unlock 4K and other things if we want to do that. But for us, just to go back to the point about benefits, I think we see 5 things. Actually, when you start to untether, if you use the mobile model of 4G or satellite with RF, you can start to really rethink some of the editorial. So you can unlock things that never happened before. So for example, when we did a 4G game on National League, which is a lower tier event in the UK, you could do things like send a cellular bonded camera off to meet the team bus of the visiting team, jump on the bus at a service station and ride in live. You would never do that in a traditional AB. You wouldn't have those kind of shots. You get them arriving off the bus, but that's it.
Right.
So you can chat with the coach on the journey, and so it gives you a completely different insight. And if you rethink how that all works, you can, to put out traditional RF coverage requires a massive array of antennas around a stadium. But we did a one shot from the coach walking down off the coach through to the front door, down the dressing rooms, out into the pitch, through the tunnel. And you just couldn't do that traditionally, all for very low cost.
And your teams, are they able to think about that? Are they creative so that they're...
Yeah, when they start to see it, it's really interesting. So we started off kind of trying to do what we already do, and then they realised that actually this is quite interesting. We can unlock some really interesting ideas, and that's why we had these kind of. And I'm sure there'll be more. We've had those ideas, but once production really get into it, they're the creative guys. They'll think of some more.
That's a good point, because if all you do is take the current fairly rigid system and say, oh, fine, we're gonna move it all centralized, you miss the benefit of people being able to innovate and try different things, and because they can now in a more flexible manner. So it shouldn't be just cost savings. It should be other things as well, because things we can't do before.
We actually think, in our list of 5 things that are interesting about remote production, cost savings is the last one, right? Yeah. If you're trying to do it to save money, you're not actually doing it for the right reason. There is some commercial advantage if you get it right, but that's really about cost transformation, not cost saving initiative to allow us to think about how we reuse that money for other things, maybe bring in some more rights, give us more hours. For us, it's more about, it's about the editorial rethinking. It's about work-life balance for staff, which I know we just talked about, but actually I can give you examples of staff who, to go on a Sunday 12:30 game in London, in the UK, in the Women's Super League, would have to go on a Saturday. That's an overnight stay from home. It's 2 days of their time away. We lose them for 2 days out of their working roster, where they can come in at lunchtime, do the game, be home for tea with the children. Yeah. So, and then the other thing is about accessibility. OB trucks are not accessible places, right? So it doesn't really allow for great inclusion. Yeah. But actually, studios are all designed, for full width, wheelchair access, etc., etc. So actually, it's a much more inclusive workplace when you work remote in a facility than an OB truck. Yeah. So there are other really interesting benefits.
And Andy, I know you've spoken about 5G a lot before. So what's going to happen?
Well, we think 5G is really exciting. So I mentioned a minute ago about the cap, and we think in a typical stadium in the UK, 4 or 5 cameras kind of maxes out. Yeah. It depends on the venue, obviously, and the number of people and everything else. But The good thing about 5G is it has a really important two new characteristics: low latency, and actually it's not really about high bandwidth, it's about manageable bandwidth. So there's a technology piece in the stack of 5G which is called slicing, where we can actually carve off dedicated bandwidth. At the minute with 4G, it's just best endeavors, everyone's sharing the same pool. And so if everyone turns up and starts streaming or using Twitter or whatever, everyone's consuming. With slicing, we can guarantee some space, and you can order it, by data rate, bandwidth size, the time you want it. It can be down to minutes. So it's much more accessible, and it's dedicated bandwidth just for this one use case.
Yeah.
And so that will make a huge difference to guaranteeing the uptime. It's a quality of service issue, basically.
I think you're going to have to be really cautious with 5G. The hype that was around 3G when it came out, then 4G, has generally never been realized, both in terms of coverage. So if you're trying to use the public network, now if you're using private 5G, with a stadium environment, that's quite good for transport and things like that. And it doesn't actually have very high bandwidth, but depending on which of the flavor you're using, whether the high sort of super millimeter or lower 600 hertz, it doesn't have very good penetration capability. So the high millimeter one won't go through a piece of paper. So it has to be very line of sight.
Yeah.
And someone's going to have to convince me on what happens in severe weather conditions with rain and sleet, for example. There's been lots of examples in other kinds of wireless technologies where that could be a bit concerning. So I think you're going to have to be very cautious on how you use it, get some real experience with it. It's taking you into a sector of telecommunications probably that there's a lot less experience with. And I think it could open up a lot of creativity. Jumping on the hype bandwagon too early can be maybe someone lives to regret, perhaps. So.
I think, I think it gets muddled very quickly on the 5G conversation, because, for example, at the NBA All-Star game, the head of AT&T was talking about how, we're going to deploy 5G, and within 3 years, you're not going to have wired broadband, which is ridiculous because it's going to be so expensive to deploy enough 5G to do that. But what you're talking about is not necessarily riding on those networks, right?
No, right.
What you guys have done and what Fox Sports did at the US Open, do you envision the same sort of thing? You bring in a dedicated node, and then you're in charge of your own node, and you can split up cameras, or do you?
No, I think it'll be. I think it's different. What we're looking at, and we're lucky to have EE as part of our family of within BT Group, and
True.
So what we're looking at is where can we strategically align cellular siting to give and put more backhaul on those sites where we won't want to do remote production over 5G, and then we can enable the slicing, to exactly your point, to make sure we've got enough bandwidth available, but in the right places. If we just ride on the back of a consumer network, it's not going to work. But if we're going to put a consumer network in, we can also isolate which cells need more backhaul and put it in at the same time.
Yeah, the line of sight backhaul is very powerful, and fairly easy to set up from that. And will be an automatically licensed spectrum, which will make it easier too for sort of private networks.
I guess the other thing that maybe you can share some insights, but what is the throughput for these nodes?
It's not. We were doing in the trial. We did at Wembley back in the summer. We were getting about 125 megabit, but the problem we had was actually attention of the whole cellular space in that area, because there's so much 4G. There wasn't much bandwidth left to add the 5G node on, because you have to piggyback on the 4G cell to then uplink to the 5G. So, it's a complicated ecosystem. They're forecasting very big numbers. I'm not sure yet what the real numbers are going to be. But.
Because I think Fox was pushed, because they were obviously dedicated. It was their own. So they were pushing through. I want to say 650?
Yeah, well, the demo the Huawei ran was showing 500 plus, but that was not in a congested cell area. Right. So this is why we have to be a little bit careful. But I still think.
And how much? I'm curious. How much of this is driven? A lot of the adoption of 4K is about marketing differentiation potentially for your viewers. Whether or not they actually are watching it in 4K, if it's filmed in 4K, can be a differentiator. Is 5G one of those? Is that something exciting for people, or is it just vendors trying to get the broadcasters excited about something?
Well, I'll speak for Fox. I think when you talk to Brad Cheney at Fox, his vision is the ability to roll into a stadium and not have to cable any cameras, and just be able to kind of just go. You get your node, you divide it up, you dedicate your bandwidth, right? So you're guaranteed. You're free of all the issues of 4G LTE, where you roll in the stadium, the fans come in and they fire up, and you're like, got nothing left. So that's what his vision is. And for golf courses especially also.
But it's not a consumer proposition in the same way of 4K.
No, I understand.
An enabler for,
and that's why it gets all muddled, because people.
But I would argue that the biggest enabler for that is finally agreeing a standard for video over IP 2110, because that's been the biggest thing that's a roadblock for people who've been able to develop equipment. And if you start to take IP and think of what you can do in other networks, we were talking about earlier, being able to effectively plug into a network, wired or wireless either, and having things automatically recognized and be able to be controlled. If you pre-wire a stadium and have enough plug-in points, I'm not sure how much it matters, but to be honest, but 5G has other great benefits because this allows you to go sort of, multicast within a stadium. So if you have a lot of people
Sure.
on
Yeah.
individual devices that you want to be able to transmit to, there's a lot of cool things that are really going to come out of that.
Experience in the stadium. Yeah, for sure.
And what about VR? Talking of new technologies.
So if you mean VR 360 or
Yeah.
virtual reality and something,
Well,
we do a lot of both. So
Yeah.
we have a unique VR 360 player within inside our normal 2D app. We do a lot of Premier League and Champions League coverage. We're going to do the Champions League final again this year in Madrid.
Right.
9-camera live created feed, got, graphics, replays, commentary, all in 360. We still think there's a place for it. The quality is improving all the time. Tile-based encoding techniques are now
Right.
maturing. One of the problems we had with 360 was you had to have 4K really to get the resolution. But you need a lot of bandwidth, and it's actually really inefficient to a point because you're only seeing on time a small area of the whole 360 sphere in 4K. If we can then use tile media encoding to specify, to prioritize the bits you want to actually send, a bit like Google Maps,
Yeah.
then it's a much more efficient way and increases the quality threshold enormously, which we think is very exciting.
So do you have any insights into how the consumers are? Do you know whether they're wearing the goggles or they're just doing the steering thing? Can you-
Mainly it's no goggles because they want to flip it out. So it's all about interactivity. So
Right.
they're not just doing VR; they're looking at all the replays and the multicam timeline. They're going back and looking at the stats and the gameplay. And
Right.
so the problem with putting your phone into your goggles, as great an experience as that is it alienates you from the rest of the experiences that are going on.
Right.
So now it's available to us. We've put these 360 clips on the replay line on the timeline at the bottom, so you can watch a multicam replay from a TV angle or a VR, or you can watch the live stream, or you can put it in the headset if you want to.
Right. Well, plus also people don't want to put their phones in it because they want to be.
They want to text and Twitter.
Yeah.
Exactly.
So you want to be online.
So do you think that do you think the goggles thing is ever going to be a thing? Like this whole concept of sitting for 3 hours?
No.
With it? No.
I think there'll be niche cases. We saw it's interesting. You get a big event, it will drive. Particular people will drive a use, and it will never be a massive use. But there are people. If it's a typical gamer, for example, the gaming community, we
Right.
know is much more engaged with goggles. So if you're a PlayStation 4 Pro user with VR, you're much more likely to use that experience
Right.
than if you're just a normal consumer.
Right.
So it's not going to be mass market, but I think on a big event basis where it's really interesting content, high value content, exciting content, it will drive some usage. But on the whole, it's all about the magic window.
Right.
You really have to be on the watch out for things that are just kind of cool and trendy and hype. Goggles I think is a prime example of it may be quite effective, but they're a stepping stone because you learn from that experience. But I think one of the challenges if you start developing for that environment is you're cutting off the social aspect. If you're watching something together, you're experiencing together, or if you're actually in the stadium, in some ways, well, you might as well just be at home in some way. So, Google Glasses, which was not overly successful, but as a first step, tells you that if you had something that allows you to, see the game, see something, and get some augmented information or things, that kind of thing starts to be very interesting. And whether or not that sticks, you're not taking away from the game, you're adding to it. Or others kind of take you out of the game in some ways. So personally, probably because I'm old, I struggle with that, and I think too many people have vertigo issues as well, with goggles and things like that. It's very hard to watch for any length of time.
Well, here at the CES show, there were some really, really compelling Google Glass type devices where sorry, I didn't mean to use air quotes, but some Google Glass devices where when you put them on, it was there'd be a whale kind of leaping out of the water and swimming in front of you like in a virtual 3D space. And it was really, it was, so you're able to see through the glasses, and then within the glasses, this was layered over the top of it.
Yeah.
I think, and it was a much more compelling experience than what Google Glass was. So
And that's much more augmented reality, where you're
Exactly,
mixing virtual and real.
Right.
And to make that interesting and compelling, in my view, to really be augmented reality, it has to interact in some way with the environment, not just be some overlay that's floating out in space.
Right.
But the whale's over there where there's a stream, and as soon as you look over this direction, there's something land-based.
I think there's some really interesting things around analysis, bringing player analysis into the home for you to be involved.
Right.
I mean, not with the glasses, but Fox in Australia did a really interesting augmented reality thing around the Bathurst race 2 years ago, where they had an app on the coasters and the bars with a QR code, and if you clicked on it and you were in the bar watching the Bathurst 1000, it brought up an AR race map, and you could look around the thing and see the rim behind you, the pub, but you could then see all the cars and So I think some interesting ideas there about bringing player analysis and things into the room with you, whether it's through glasses or otherwise.
Yeah.
So that's
It's
going
definitely
to
about augmented.
the next big thing. So we have to wrap up. So that was a great conversation between the three of you.
That's it.
That's it.
Just getting started.
Just warming up.
Yeah, that's where I'm at.
Yeah. So thank you very much for coming on
Thanks,
NAB
Sadie.
Show Live, and have a great show.
Thanks.
Thank you.
You too.
Thank you.
This hour sponsored by Atto, the power behind the storage.
This is NAB Show Live.
Mike.
Hi, and welcome to NAB Show Live, brought to you by Broadcast Beat. And we are going to talk for the next session about AR, VR, MR. We've already had a bit of a chat about this already, so I don't know who wants to go first, but we've got Nick here from NCAM, we've got Ash from Disguise, Halva from the Future Group, and Olivier from Chiron Hago. So where do you want to start? I mean, we were talking about MR or VR or AR. So who wants to give everyone the briefest explanation of all the differences? Because everyone's very confused.
I've got a question as to, is MR the same as AR? Augmented reality we're talking about, I guess.
Yeah.
Is it the same? Is it a different term? I don't know. For me, it's the same. I mean, there's really
I have
no
like
difference.
sort of an opinion on MR and AR myself. I would say MR is when you blend reality. So you need a mix of green screen and real set and AR all together. So it's sort of like blending completely environments. So it's a mix of virtual set, in fact, and AR and real set together.
Yeah, I mean, I think, mixed reality and augmented reality is effectively the same thing. But we can have a, virtual set as a background.
It's
For me,
continuation of the hard set, like blending, when you have that edge, and then you put other objects inside as well. So I think that's the closest we can get, no?
I think there's a lot of ambiguity in the terms that people are using. I mean, at Disguise we tend to use the word MR to mean where you put the content onto screens that are being shot by camera, which some people call green screen replacement, where you're replacing the green screen with something that you can actually see and look at, whether it's LED or projection. But I think the terms are pretty fluid, so it's probably wise to be as precise as possible.
And by the way, it's the same in the consumer world, I would say, with these Googles, where people are confused, or the HoloLens, or you will do like a Oculus, what's VR, what's AR, what's mixed reality also.
I mean, personally, AR is, to me, means when you put the pair of glasses on and you can look through but in TV it's used to mean putting graphics on top of it.
Yeah. I think graphics or immerse people into a virtuality.
Yeah.
And so why would you use AR over sort of standard graphics in broadcast?
I think AR presents a whole plethora of new opportunities to enhance the storytelling. It enables you to do things that you wouldn't otherwise perhaps afford to do or choose to do because it didn't really make sense. I think also what it does, and this is perhaps a little bit down the line, but I think the push for virtual production technology, including AR and virtual studio technology, is really a push towards new ways of monetizing content. New ways of engaging the audience is fine. Creating a higher production value is fine. But I do think eventually this will have to lead to a discussion of how do you leverage these technologies to essentially drive monetization in new ways.
But in terms of today and the applications, there are numerous. But as a virtual set, it has to be really useful to be able to not build a physical set or build a small part of a physical set. Because I think, although that's been around for a long time, has the quality been high enough to actually look like a real set? Has the quality been high enough? I'm not sure if it has. I think now, I think we're there. I think we're getting there, and I think it's easier to do. It's accessible, right?
Yeah.
And the quality, the robustness, that's all accessible and doable. And I think, with our technologies together, our customers can deliver that within, it's fairly easy to do.
And in what situations does it work best? I mean, we were doing earlier a panel about sports and we were talking about it.
I think when you need to visualize data, it works really well because it's a compelling way to tell the story and illustrate the data inside the studio set,
Yeah.
I think gaming, for example, entertainment, esports, weather, because you explain phenomenon and you can really interact with the phenomenon. I mean, you guys done a fantastic job, by the way.
Thank you.
We compete, but we recognize when you guys do a great job.
What was the fantastic job for?
It was the Weather Channel.
The Weather.
I think.
Yeah.
Oh, yeah.
Yeah, so
Yeah.
really immersing into like a storm,
Yeah.
where you tell the story of the storm and the people are right in between what's going on,
Yeah, the Weather Channel stuff was great. I think it was quite groundbreaking. We've been working with those guys for years on how to help that from a camera tracking perspective.
And I think it serves as a very good example of the enhancement of the storytelling, because essentially, in a situation like, for instance, the storm surge, you can show color codes on a map. You can look at you can look outside and you'll see the trees blowing. But actually having the audience understand the consequences, and when you flood a street, like the Weather Channel did, when you can see that literally there is no room for air in your house anymore, it just becomes very real. Even though, in that particular execution, it was still very clear that it was a simulation. We all know water can't stand upright. But it still creates that tangible feeling of what this might look like in my neighborhood. And so I think that's a very good example of where Virtual Studio really truly comes to sort of its natural right. And it's just, one of very, I believe, many examples of how you could use this. And I would actually reverse the question you asked, in what situations does a Virtual Studio work? I think where we are is rather to flip it around and say, in what situation doesn't it work?
Yeah.
Because I think, as you said, with the quality increasing, talent becoming more used to being on green screen, people, being able to utilize the tools that are out there to create these experiences. I think, there's the examples of where you wouldn't use it are becoming fewer and farther between.
I think it also resonates to audience changing as well as age. Well, I remember having conversation with Sky in Australia in the past 15 years ago when I had my own company selling virtual, and telling them, like, look, at some point the audience age will change, and what you think would be a reproduction of your heart set that you need to mimic, people won't care. They will want to have some action, and it does look good. That's all that matters,
I think there's some practical benefits as well. I mean, it's quite prosaic, but the idea that you could have a very small studio that can actually look like a large studio and can take on multiple functions. So it could be a news studio 1 minute, it could be a broadcast station another time. That sort of practical benefit of not having to have physical set items, I think is underrepresented a little bit.
Yeah, and how do you think AR will evolve in the future? I mean, what's next?
AR for the broadcast space?
Yeah.
I think we're going to see more and more of it. I think the work that we collectively did for CBS for the Super Bowl is a good example. Essentially adding a full stadium-size AR graphic to do something really cool. Break the whole sort of field apart and do something more. I think it's a very good example of how you can apply this to really huge events and at huge scale. So I think it'll just. We like to say on our booth, in our demo, we say, finally your imagination is the only limitation. And I think that's very true.
And I think it's all about the quality and the believability, right? So if we can merge those two worlds, the virtual and the real, so that the viewer just simply cannot tell the difference, that's one step, and we're getting there. But it's the interactivity as well. So how do I interact with something that is not there? Can I walk around it? Is there depth? Can I interact with it? What else can I do?
I'm not sure if I agree that realism is kind of the be all and end all. I don't think anyone looking at spinning logos on TV thinks that they're
No, that's different.
They get that they get that they're synthetic. I think it's more to do with engaging people. It doesn't have to look realistic to be engaging.
Yeah.
It just has to be fun.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And it has to look
has,
good.
it has to communicate clearly
Yeah.
like what you're trying to communicate. And
I think the improvement in our systems on technology will be more on the workflow side, because we have been tedious system to use sometimes. And when we are improving that a lot by using common tools like Unreal that we all use, by using like common framework that we are trying to all converge to in the same way, and for broadcasters to use common tools in order to operate, change, and fulfill. So that thing is evolving as well in terms of usability in the right sense. And what I could see in the future is that all the machine that we bring to do that is still a bit tedious, we'll go back into a cloud server as well. We'll do everything remote, where we'll get the tracking data from NCAM. We'll put our engine into a cloud server and say how many cameras you have and how many insertion you want. I can do that for you. You don't have to hire a crew for doing that.
it's very interesting to think that you might be able to spin up more instances of your renderer if your graphics are very high demand, and then
Exactly.
if you're doing something quite simple, you would only have a couple of machines online.
Yeah.
And the idea that a studio might have multiple studio spaces that can share resources.
Correct.
Quite an interesting
So it's one of the things that I think you guys have noticed is that we always have like a channel of box per camera, and if we go there, it will disappear. We will be able to scale much more the use of it.
Yeah. Precisely. Yeah.
So with mixed reality, I'm looking at you, Ash. 'Cause, what does it offer that VR doesn't offer?
I think the problem with VR is that there's only one person that can see it, which is the person who's got the thing on their head. And with green screen, the issue that you have is that you can only see what's happening if you look at the confidence monitor.
Yeah.
Which means that if you're a professional and you know how to do that, then you're comfortable on set. But if you're a member of the public, say, coming in to be interviewed, it's much more difficult to understand how to behave on that set. Whereas if you have a set around you that's visible, that you can look at, that lights you correctly, it's much easier to be natural and to feel comfortable in that environment. Everybody who's in the audience, if you have an audience, so not all TV studios have no audience. There are sometimes people watching it.
Yeah.
And if you have to produce a show for them too, then it's better to have something actually to look at rather than just green screen. Then the other few things, like if let's say you're holding a Macintosh laptop on your lap, that's going to reflect the green from the green screen.
Yeah.
Having that not something that you have to remove in post is actually a big advantage. So there's a few benefits to kind of post green screen or green screen replacement, and that I think making it more engaging, I think, is the end result.
Yeah. And do you think people would use VR would be more popular if it wasn't for the headsets? Is it back to the 3D glasses?
I don't believe in that myself at all.
I think the technology will get better. It'll always have a place, but at the end of the day, people do want to connect with each other.
Yeah, there's a problem of heavy lifting.
Yeah.
I mean, I have tons of this headset at home, and even my kids who love technology, they code, doing Blocksy stuff, they cannot wear them more than, like I would say, an hour maximum.
The new AR glasses are pretty cool.
This is
the Magic Leap stuff, the HoloLens 2 stuff's pretty.
The HoloLens,
pretty
you've been using?
The new one's pretty good. It's I think it's pretty impressive.
Could be HoloLens, but still, like we had that hype with the 3D stereoscopic altogether here.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And the glasses were thin,
Yeah.
And these people didn't want to wear them at home.
Yeah. I mean, I think the technology will get better. I don't think they'll ever
will.
completely take over.
Absolutely. Yeah, think of the iPhone 1, right? I mean, it didn't even have copy and paste.
True.
What we could see is maybe like a lens, contact lens,
Yeah, I mean,
Yeah.
connected
all of these
contact
things
lens
will
that
happen.
can distort
There you go.
reality. That would work.
I think also what you're seeing though is a lot of people are aware of AR because Apple delivered it on their phones and
Yeah.
Google delivered it on their phones, so they sort of
Right.
expect to see it. If you don't have it, then you're sort of
You're not the
behind,
cool
aren't you?
kid.
So it's almost
Yeah.
becoming a hygiene thing that everyone has to do, whether they like it or not.
Yeah. And are you seeing that people are they're having to produce the content differently?
Yes.
Yes.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
Key.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And that's not a small one for a very small audience,
Yeah.
So you're a big investment, big pain
Yes.
for a very small audience who won't spend that much time. I mean,
I think that's a really important point about the content. There just isn't enough people producing live content that are able to. We're seeing Unreal come through, and games engines. being able to create that content, without that, where there's not much point in being around for me. You know, that's absolutely massively important, and something that maybe we don't talk enough about is, you know, how are we going to get enough people to create the content?
No, exactly. This is you know, an early project that we did was an interactive game show that we did together with Fremantle Media. This is a few years ago now, but it ties very well into the content discussion, because if you design an entertainment experience to work across multiple screens, or work with AR goggles, or work with VR, then you can't just make a show and then just copy paste that over to the second screen. You need to think about how is this all going to tie together? How are we going to make sure that we don't alienate our traditional audience on the single screen, while still enhancing the experience for the audience to choose to engage on multiple screens or through other types of devices? This is critical. And you know, this will involve a lot of trial and error. We were super encouraged when we did launch Lost in Time to see that, in fact, 1/3 of our TV viewing audience did engage interactively. We did not expect to see that number that high, but it's still, you know, it was by no means perfect. It was a first stab at trying to do something, you know, in a new way. But I think if we really engage in this, you know, this is what, you know, virtual production at large, it lends itself very well to this. We just need to experiment, and we need to figure out how to do this.
You could do 360 degrees much more easy with using virtual technologies, you know, because you render all these virtual cameras where these guys have to actually shoot them, you know. But, you know, myself and the Google stuff, you know, I don't, and I've tried, you know.
And are those skill sets coming from the gaming industry? Is that where we're going to attract everyone from?
I think what we're seeing is, you know, visual effects companies, the digital content post-production companies, starting to use real-time engines and real-time, you know, capabilities. We're certainly seeing that from the likes of, you know, the Mill or Moving Picture Company. Technicolor, you know, they're all training up on this, and all of those very high-end visual effects companies, certainly, and then there's that convergence between, you know, film, TV, and broadcast that we're seeing. Games. That's what we're seeing, right?
So, what do you think's next?
Hang on, we've hardly started on this.
Crystal ball.
We've only just started.
I think we already discussed that.
I mean, I think that this stuff is going to become part of the natural language of television.
Yeah.
You'll see it everywhere. Just as we're used to seeing, you know, two-dimensional graphical elements in the background of every show now. Everything has to be moving constantly, otherwise it feels dead, it feels flat. I think we're going to start to expect this to be in every show. And I think that's going to become the interesting part, because to be original and to be different is going to become the challenge.
The limit is the imagination, right?
Yeah, and you know, I think one of the really interesting trends that I see is, you know, we used to talk about very defined categories in the entertainment space. We used to talk about game companies, and we used to talk about broadcasters, and we used to talk about movie production. You know, take DJ Marshmallow's appearance inside Fortnite. You know, so what does that make Fortnite? It's still just a
merging,
game. It's something else.
Converging.
Exactly, and this is I think super exciting. It's one of those things that, you know, it's difficult to tell. You know, like you said, what's next? But it's, you know, we will just keep moving and keep breaking down those boundaries, and you know, it's super exciting.
Definitely an interesting thing that we noticed was, now that you can broadcast to a very specific audience over the internet, you can find huge audiences for very niche things. You know, like esports is a really good example. You can find, you know, 300 million viewers, double the Super Bowl's viewership for, you know, a championship of an esports tournament. And so therefore the kind of creative opportunities you have become quite interesting, because you don't have to please a large group of people. You can do something very focused that still hits a lot of people.
Yeah, and I think fan engagement, audience engagement is what it's all about, right? So the younger audiences coming through, they don't necessarily want to sit there and watch a physical motor race for, you know, the cars going round and round. Kind of gets tedious. So if we can make that more interactive, and maybe they can join in on their own car virtually, you know, from their home.
polling, playing and polling
Yeah.
is stuff
Yeah.
that, and AR can serve that
Exactly.
really well because you can actually visualize data in the studio while you're polling, so this kind of stuff is going to happen more and more.
Yeah.
What else we could think of? Collecting data and creating environment depending on what we know about people.
Yeah, absolutely.
So customize content, create the virtual world that corresponds to, the viewership basically, based on what we know when we talk to them.
I mean, just simply presenting things in the language that the viewer understands, is going to be.
I think customized content is definitely coming. It still requires to find that interface, to find that data collection method, and to make it valuable to the audience, because that's what it comes down to. It can't be gimmicky. That's cool for a little while, and it's cool to show your friends, but in order to really drive engagement, it needs to make sense. And it's a whole new way of thinking about content production.
Yeah. Right, well, that was a great discussion. Thank you very much for NAB Show Live.
This hour sponsored by Addo, the power behind the storage.